Look at a map of the world. Every line on it looks natural, permanent, like it was always there, but almost none of these borders were drawn by the people who live inside them. They were drawn by conquerors, diplomats, and strangers, with rulers in distant rooms, often in a hurry. Most of the borders on Earth are not lines, they are scars, and they are still bleeding. This is why. You were born inside a line. Because of that, you accept it. It feels as ancient as the oceans or the mountains, but it isn't. In fact, the vast majority of the lines defining our world are incredibly young. More than 60% of all current international borders were established in a brief, volatile window between 1880 and 1945, a mere blink in human history. Before this era of rapid partitioning, political limits were fluid. Communities blended together, and ethnic groups migrated with the seasons, entirely free from customs checkpoints, passport controls, or razor wire. We mistake the modern map for a photograph of Earth's geography. In truth, it is a ledger of political decisions. It is a physical record of who had the power, who had the guns, and who was left entirely without a voice. Every straight line cutting across a desert or splitting a river basin represents a moment where outsiders prioritized administrative ease over human reality. These lines were imposed from the top down, transforming connected cultures into hard, divided territories. This is the illusion. We look at the globe and see permanent structure, but we are actually looking at a fragile artificial design. If these borders are not natural, then they are jagged historical scars carved into the fabric of human society. Scars that dictate who belongs, who is legal, and who is cast out. To understand the violence of our present, we must examine these moments of creation. Because the ultimate question is not where the line sits on your screen today. The question is, who got to hold the pen? Look at a globe. Focus on Northern Africa or the Arabian Peninsula. You will see perfectly straight lines running for hundreds of miles through empty sand. Nature does not work this way. Rivers bend, mountain ranges curve, forests blend. A straight political line is a biological impossibility on a living planet. The moment a border becomes a geometric vector, you are looking at the work of a stranger. In the winter of 1884, 14 nations gathered in a heated room in Berlin. They laid out a giant map of Africa, a continent 3 times the size of Europe. No Africans were in the room, not one. Armed with ink pens and brass rulers, men who had never seen the Congo or the Sahara began partitioning the land. They drew lines through kingdoms, split water sources, and forced rival communities into the same artificial cages. By the time they finished, nearly half of Africa's borders were straight lines. 3 decades later, the same pen moved to the Middle East. In 1916, 2 diplomats, Mark Sykes of Britain and François-Georges Picot of France, sat in a quiet room with a grease pencil. With a single stroke running from the E in Acre to the V in Kirkuk, they divided the post-Ottoman Arab world. The line did not account for tribes, trade routes, or religious communities. It accounted only for imperial division. The shape of these lines is the physical proof of who had the power. The straightest borders are the coldest ones because they show exactly where the cartographer's ruler bypassed the human beings living on the ground. When a line is drawn by a stranger thousands of miles away, it does not function as a shield. It functions as a knife. These imperial cartographers had the luxury of time. They spent months in comfortable European salons negotiating their terms. But the world would soon learn that there is something far more volatile than a line drawn in secret by a patient empire. It is a line drawn in a panic by a desperate nation trying to escape. July 8, 1947. A British judge named Cyril Radcliffe steps off a plane in New Delhi. He has never set foot in India before. He does not know the languages, the culture, the complex geography, or the millions of souls whose lives he is about to alter. Yet, he holds a pen that will slice an entire subcontinent in half. The British Empire is in a desperate, panic-stricken hurry to leave. Decades of colonial rule are collapsing under the weight of debt and rising rebellion, and London wants out immediately. They give Radcliffe 5 weeks, just 35 days, to draw a boundary through a territory home to nearly 400 million people, Radcliffe is locked in a sweltering bungalow surrounded by outdated maps, local complaints, and census reports from 1931. He has no time for a physical survey. He cannot ride on horseback to inspect the villages, the farms, or the ancient irrigation networks he is about to divide. Under extreme pressure, with the clock ticking towards zero, he simply sits at a table and traces ink across paper, slicing through the historic, interconnected provinces of Punjab and Bengal. The line cuts blindly. It divides communities that have lived together for centuries. It splits homes in two, leaving the kitchen in one country and the bedroom in another. It severs railway tracks, irrigation canals, and ancestral fields. The people living on the ground have no say in this process, and they are kept completely in the dark. They do not even know where the international border is until after it has already become law. On August 15, 1947, the British military formally hands over power. 2 days later, on August 17, 1947, the Radcliffe Line is officially disclosed to the public. Chaos erupts instantly. Imagine waking up to discover that your ancestral home is suddenly on the wrong side of a political line. Millions of Hindus and Sikhs find themselves trapped in the newly declared Pakistan. Millions of Muslims find themselves in India. Fear turns to panic. Panic turns to violence. Neighbors turn on neighbors in a desperate scramble for survival. Trains carrying families arrive at stations filled with nothing but corpses. It triggers one of the largest, most violent human mass migrations in modern history. Approximately 15 million people are forced to flee their homes. They walk in massive, desperate columns, carrying whatever they can carry through choking dust and heat. Up to 2 million people are killed in the madness. This was not a natural transition. It was a surgical amputation performed in a blind panic. The scar of that rapid division remains open. Look at the northern tip of the subcontinent at Kashmir. This region, caught in the gears of Radcliffe's rushed partition, remains a militarized flashpoint to this day. 3 wars have been fought over it. Thousands of soldiers and civilians have died. The border here is not a quiet line on a map. It is a heavily armed trench where families are permanently separated by razor wire. When a foreign empire runs out of time, it does not clean up its mess. It simply draws a line, packs its bags, and leaves. But the ink never truly dries, and the scars left behind continue to bleed. Midnight, August 10th, 1945. Inside a sweltering office in Washington, D.C., 2 young American officers are handed an impossible task. Japan is surrendering, Soviet troops are already marching into northern Korea, and the United States has no forces nearby to stop them. They need a line, a boundary to halt the Soviet advance, and they have exactly 30 minutes to find it. Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel are not East Asian experts. They have never set foot in Korea, nor do they speak a word of the language. Under extreme time pressure, they do not consult historians, geographers, or a single Korean citizen. Instead, they pull out a 1936 National Geographic map of Asia. They look at the peninsula. They spot the 38th parallel. It looks clean. It divides the territory roughly in half, keeping the capital of Seoul safely in the American zone. With a single pencil stroke, they slice a nation in 2. This line had zero basis in Korean history. For over 1,000 years, Korea had existed as a unified peninsula, bound by a shared language, ancestral culture, and continuous geography. Now, an arbitrary military division was imposed on a magazine map by 2 men in a hurry. It was meant to be provisional. It became permanent. Within 5 years, this temporary occupation boundary hardened into a concrete border, then erupted into a catastrophic war. Millions died. When the fighting finally stopped, the line remained, rebranded as the demilitarized zone. But the true violence of this boundary is not measured in landmines or barbed wire. It is measured in families. Overnight, millions of parents, siblings, and children were separated. A sudden, impenetrable wall dropped between them. For 80 years, those families have lived just miles apart, yet completely cut off. Most have grown old and died without ever hearing their loved ones' voices again, or even knowing if they survived. A 30-minute decision. A lifetime of grief. This is how a hasty, provisional line became one of the most dangerous borders on Earth. It is a permanent, militarized scar running across the 38th parallel, proving that the most enduring borders are often those born from the deepest panic. And the pen is about to move again. Imagine a family home where the front door is in one country and the backyard is in another. For the Pashtun people, this is not a metaphor. It is their daily reality. In the autumn of 1893, a British civil servant named Mortimer Durand sat in Kabul with a fountain pen. He was there to solve a problem for the British Empire: how to protect the crown jewel of India from a rising Russian Empire to the north. His solution was a buffer zone. With a few strokes of ink, Durand drew a line stretching 1,600 miles through the rugged Hindu Kush mountains. He called it a frontier. But to the millions of people living there, it was a sudden, violent severance. The Durand Line did not follow rivers, valleys, or ancient tribal treaties. It sliced directly through the Pashtun homeland, a region bound by a language, a shared code of honor, and centuries of kinship. Overnight, clans, families, and marriages were split between British India and Afghanistan. The Afghan state never accepted this line as a legitimate international border. They viewed it as a temporary imperial lease forced upon them under the threat of British guns. When British India dissolved in 1947 and Pakistan was born, the new state inherited this artificial line. Afghanistan refused to recognize it. Today, this 130-year-old ink stroke remains an active, bleeding wound. You can see the physical scar from space. It is a massive, multi-billion-dollar chain-link fence topped with razor wire, constructed by Pakistan to fortify what was once a porous tribal highway. At crossings like Torkham and Chaman, families wait for days under the baking sun, clutching papers, separated from their ancestral fields and cousins by concrete barricades and armed guards. But the line did not just divide families, it created a legal vacuum, a lawless tribal belt, where insurgent groups, smugglers, and militants moved through the mountain passes, exploiting the division the empire created. The British pen sought to build a wall of security. Instead, it carved a permanent fault line. A frontier designed to protect an empire has become a sanctuary for chaos, proving that when you slice through a living culture with a ruler, the wound never truly heals. And the world was about to see that this pattern of imperial carving was not an exception. It was the blueprint. August 13th, 1961. Midnight in Berlin. While the city slept, thousands of soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder. They carried rolls of barbed wire, concrete posts, and picks. Within hours, they began tearing up the asphalt. They drove wooden stakes into the cobblestones. They strung wire across gardens, through cemeteries, and directly down the middle of residential streets. By dawn, a metropolis was sliced in half. Imagine waking up on a Sunday morning. You walk downstairs to visit your sister across the street, but there is a line of armed guards standing where the pavement used to be. You cannot pass. You cannot even wave. This was the birth of the Berlin Wall. It did not happen through slow, natural migration. It was a sudden, violent cleavage. Following World War II, the victorious Allied powers split Germany and its capital city into 4 occupation zones. What was meant to be a temporary administrative grid quickly became a physical fault line of the Cold War. But Berlin was a glaring anomaly, a capitalist island locked inside a communist state. To stop the migration of citizens fleeing to the West, the East German regime did not negotiate. They did not redraw a map. They simply brought out the concrete. The border did not just separate 2 hostile ideologies, it ran through apartment buildings. In the early days, people jumped from 3rd-story windows onto West Berlin sidewalks below, until East German police bricked up the windows, turning outer walls into blind facades. Families were divided instantly, trapped on opposite sides of a gray concrete barrier that would endure for 28 years. The wall became a physical monument of ideological rivalry, enforced by landmines, watchtowers, and automatic firing systems. Then, on November 9th, 1989, a bureaucratic mistake opened the gates. Tens of thousands of Berliners swarmed the checkpoints. Armed with hammers and chisels, they began hacking away at the concrete. The wall did not decay over centuries. It was smashed to pieces in a weekend. This is the clearest proof of the artificial map. If a border can be built in a single night by political decree, it can be torn down in another by the sheer force of human hands. The most common way to draw a border is brutally direct. You win a war. We like to believe that national boundaries reflect the natural home of a specific population, but history reveals a far more clinical reality. Borders are the ultimate trophies of war. They are spoils of victory, traded like currency across green felt tables in distant palace rooms. When the guns fall silent, the people who live through the trauma do not get a say. Instead, a small, elite class of victors takes control of the pen. In 1919, inside the Palace of Versailles, the Allied powers gathered to reshape Europe. The resulting treaties bypassed consensus to impose a new order. Defeated empires were systematically dismantled. New nations, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, were carved out of the wreckage. Frontiers were reassigned, and millions of people woke up as citizens of entirely different countries. Losers had no control over the lines that defined their descendants. But the true violence of this victor-take-all mapping reached its peak after the Second World War. The Potsdam Agreement shifted borders and cleared the human beings living near them. To align the population with the new Soviet and Polish lines, the victors authorized the forced transfer of over 12 million Germans. It remains one of the largest forced expulsions in human history. Families were packed into cargo trains, stripped of their belongings, and driven westward. Cartographers ignored local histories and regional cultures. They moved borders, then forced humanity to fit those borders. This is how victory writes itself onto the land. The borders defining our world today are not natural fits. They are the scars of old triumphs carved into the earth by those who won the right to hold the pen. But what happens when the map completely ignores your existence? For some, the line is not a barrier to cross. It is a direct denial of their right to exist. When empires drew their boundaries, they did more than divide lands. They erased entire nations, leaving millions of people without a state to call home. Consider the Kurds, an ancient population with a shared language, culture, and homeland. Yet when the modern Middle East was carved up after the First World War, their territory was fractured. Today, over 30 million Kurds find themselves split across 4 different countries. They are the largest stateless people on Earth. Their identity is treated as a security threat by the very states that contain them. For the Kurds, the borders are not protective shields. They are prison walls. Further south, Palestinians live trapped within lines drawn systematically against them. They survive under a legal grid of military checkpoints, separation walls, and administrative barriers. Their daily movement is dictated by a cartography designed to restrict, fragment, and displace. In Southeast Asia, the Rohingya face an even more absolute exclusion. Denied citizenship by Myanmar, they live without legal identity or state protection. They are pushed across frontiers, fleeing systemic violence, only to find themselves trapped in squalid refugee camps in Bangladesh. They are unwanted on either side of the line. This is the quietest crisis of the modern map. When a people exists but their line does not, survival itself becomes a daily political battle. These are not sovereign citizens with passports and rights. They are stateless survivors, trapped in the gaps between other people's borders. For them, the lines on the globe do not represent order or security. They represent a permanent, ongoing exile. In July 1964, the newly independent leaders of Africa gathered in Cairo. For the first time, they held the pens. They possessed the sovereign power to erase the straight lines, the divided valleys, and the geometric cages imposed on them by European empires. They could have redrawn the continent to match the human reality on the ground. Instead, they chose to keep the scars. The newly formed Organization of African Unity passed a binding resolution. It established a rigid doctrine. The borders inherited at independence were untouchable. They acted out of existential fear. The immediate logic was simple: to prevent endless war. If these new nations tried to realign their frontiers with actual ethnic, linguistic, or historical territories, the entire continent would dissolve into a bloodbath. Every boundary would become an active front line. Neighbors would fight neighbors over every water source, forest, and village. To avoid absolute catastrophe, African leaders made a tragic, pragmatic calculation. They chose stability over justice. But this choice froze old wounds into permanent state lines. By preserving the colonial boundaries, they locked in the original violence of the cartographers. The arbitrary divisions drawn in distant European salons were suddenly transformed into sacred, unchangeable international law. The artificial cages became permanent. Generations of families remained divided by administrative limits they had no role in creating. Newly sovereign states became the armed guardians of their own colonial prisons, forced to defend the very lines designed to exploit them. By choosing survival, they guaranteed that the ghosts of empire would continue to rule. Because a line drawn in violence does not become peaceful just because a new flag flies above it. And those frozen fault lines were about to fracture. The ink has never dried. Right now, as you look at a screen, the lines on our global map are actively bleeding. We treat the map as a finished picture, but it is a living, violent process happening in real time. In the high, freezing mountain passes of Kashmir, Indian and Pakistani soldiers still stare at each other through thermal scopes across a live, lethal boundary. A line drawn in a rush 80 years ago is still claiming lives today. In Israel and Palestine, the border is not a quiet geographic limit. It is an ongoing crisis of sovereignty enforced by concrete walls, razor wire, and military checkpoints that dictate every second of daily life. Look at South Sudan. As the world's youngest sovereign state, it shows exactly what happens when empires leave behind unfinished borders. Those unresolved lines, combined with internal fractures, continue to fuel civil war, displacement, and constant instability. And along the blood-soaked plains of Ukraine, we are reminded that borders are never permanent. They are militarized, heavily disputed lines being violently redrawn right now by tanks and heavy artillery. We like to tell ourselves that the modern world has moved past boundaries. But the opposite is true. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, governments have built thousands of miles of new steel and concrete barriers. More walls are rising today than at any point in human history. History is not past tense. The map is an active battlefield. Every line is a scar, and those scars are still being carved into the earth. Subscribe to explore the hidden forces shaping our global map. The map on your wall is not a neutral geographic record. It is a confession. Every single line on it holds a secret. It shows who had the power, who had the guns, and who was left entirely without a voice. To see the world as it truly is, you must learn to read these scars. You must ask 3 simple questions of any border on Earth. Who drew it? When was it drawn? And why? When you look at the straight lines of Africa or the Middle East, you do not see natural divisions. You see the cold ink of foreign empires negotiating in quiet rooms, completely ignoring the communities living on the ground. When you look at the militarized divisions of Korea, Kashmir, or the Durand Line, you see the panic of a retreating power, the sudden, violent choices of men in a hurry. The line always reveals the war, the conquest, or the negotiation that produced it. It tells you exactly who was in the room holding the pen, and more importantly, who was locked outside. This is how you decode the violence of our present. The conflicts we see today are not spontaneous explosions of ancient hatreds. They are the active, bleeding infections of old, artificial cuts. When you ask those 3 questions, the political illusions fade away. Once you know how to look, you can never unsee it. The map ceases to be a picture of the earth. It becomes a record of raw power. The ink on our maps dried long ago, but the bleeding has never stopped. These lines are not geography. They are scars. Every day, millions of people still live and die within margins drawn by long-dead strangers. We see a world of order, but the map is actually an active wound. Subscribe to uncover the hidden forces shaping our world.